week of this series before the format's going to change. We know everybody's gone back to school, and this time on Friday is really not convenient for most of you at this point. Plus, we didn't know if this was the best way for us to answer your needs, given that you are now in the thick of whatever you're experiencing with your schools.
Mhm.
So I posted a survey, a poll on the group, and it looks like most people are going to want me to do a Saturday morning one at 11, which I think will work well. We'll only do it once a month instead, so you'll have time to kind of gather your ideas and your thoughts and give us a heads up about what would be most useful for where you are right now. But this week, Isaac, we're going to be talking about teaching students to reflect and self-assess, which are basically the heart of everything that we do when we think about the formative process and getting kids to be advocates for their own learning. And I know on the 12th grade level, when I was doing this in my English classes, many of my students had not done this at an earlier age. So in a lot of ways, we were starting from scratch. And the most important distinction you need to understand is that reflection and self-assessment are not the same thing in this context. Reflection is what we have kids doing all the time. It's getting them to think about their learning, think about their process. Where are they struggling? Where are they successful? And most importantly, why? So that they know where their missteps are happening and how they could better ask for help. Self-assessment comes after they've done the reflection. They take this time then to think about whatever strategies, skills, content that they're supposed to be working on and determine where they are in the process at that point, where they're actually trying to figure out if they've met the mark. So for what we're trying to think about, the reflection leads to the self-assessment, which is actually them considering what level of mastery they've achieved, proficiency or not there yet. What does that look like, Isaac, for younger learners? How do you get them to reflect and self-assess when they're, K to 2?
Right. So the good news is the thinking is the same. And of course, the content is going to be somewhat different. Young children naturally are comparing themselves to others and comparing their work to others or how well they sing or whatever it might be. So I think what really happens is we take that and we add some structure and give it a clear purpose. Because often when a child naturally does that, it's a very personal comparison. It doesn't have any clear criteria. So they may feel superior or inferior, neither of which are appropriate or helpful. But once we say, hey, this is what it means to do a good job at blank, and we decide that with them, then they can be much more clear on where they're going. So one of the best places to start in pre-K and K is with their drawings, because drawing can be done well or poorly. Any skill happens along a progression. And at the highest levels, it's very, very subjective. But at the beginning stages, it's rather objective. Do you have foreground and background? Do you have characters that can be recognized as the animal or person they are? Are they floating? And, so a lot of times how we start the year with these guys is we sit down and we make some examples together. We look at some samples together and just talk about them. What's good about this one? What's good about this one? What's good about this one? And then maybe the next day, if we had to put these in order to see how a kid got better, what order would they go in? So that once they see it and talk about it, they really know, oh, okay, I'm drawing these, if you work with young kids, those mandala figures that have the little circle body with some legs and arms popping out, which is an important step in becoming an artist. But it's not the final step. So we can see what is that beyond, and then what is beyond that step. And as soon as kids have some examples and just a little bit of language for it, they just take it and run with it. And the language may be as simple as, I'm not that one yet, or I used to do that. But yeah, I think we start with things they know. And drawing is one of those, or even behaviors,
Well, I mean, what's interesting is I'm sure those of you who have been watching these weekly shows have noticed a real theme that before we can really expect students to understand how to think about their
Right.
learning and how to be metacognitive, there are certain structures that need to be in place so that it's not just, I liked doing this assignment,
Mhm.
I liked working with my friends, I did not like the person in my group who did not do any work. Like in order for them to be really capable of talking about their
Mhm.
learning, we have to provide them with really direct instruction and modeling for what that looks like. And we have to provide models and we have to give them
Mhm.
clear criteria, because it can be, I mean, when we think about adult learners and thinking about the way we do reflect on different things in our lives, obviously we could differentiate the different kinds of reflection that we do. But when it
Mhm.
comes to learning new things and what's working and what isn't working, part of what makes us more successful at it is that we understand what mastery looks like before we start. And I could also give you a non-school example. So I
Mhm.
know I've talked a lot before about my burgeoning mountain biking skill
Yeah.
set. um, I'm super good on the trainer, but of course, on the trainer, I don't have to worry about balance or other
Mhm.
outside
Mhm.
obstacles that come across you when you're actually riding in the woods. Or if you're riding on the street, cars and other obstructions like having to stop for lights and having to go with the flow of people being on sidewalks, or just doing different things that, even though technically I might be very good at pedaling, like I might have a very smooth pedal stroke now
Mhm.
while I'm on the bike, and I might be able to monitor my heart rate while I'm staring at a screen watching what makes my heart rate increase or decrease and pace myself in a different way. But what I'm noticing is that my transfer skills to the actual outside experience
Yeah.
aren't necessarily as good as I want them to be. And my husband used to be a professional cyclist, and when I watch him ride, he makes it look really easy. Like sometimes I
Mhm.
just watch him and I'm like, I should be able to do that. I understand the mechanics. I know how to stop. I know how to pedal. I know how to, approach different obstacles that come in my way. I
Mhm.
also know how to clip my shoes in and out when I'm on the trainer. But when I'm in an emergency situation where my feet need to come out of the pedals, they
Mhm.
don't always come out of the pedals the way that I need them to, which
Yeah.
results in a crash, unfortunately. And when we think about our learners in that way, the first part is understanding what mastery
Mhm.
looks like. The second part is understanding where they are on that spectrum. And then the third part is understanding where the transfer is or is not happening, and then figuring out what strategies need to be taken in order to get them to that place where we want them all to be on that mastery
Mhm.
side. And so I know even with my 12th graders, with my ninth grade L's, with everybody, the first time I asked them to write a reflection for me, because obviously in an English class, the writing is a part of what goes on, although writing is not the only way, as Isaac
Mhm.
suggested, to do reflecting. They could do video, they could do audio, they could be drawing, they could just be having a conversation with you, depending on their age, about where they are. um, I always scaffolded the writing process for them so that as we were going through the reflection, there were certain things I expected to see about the learning experience. And I know I've mentioned this before. I wanted them to tell me what they thought they were supposed to be doing. And that was always the starting point so that I could norm my
Mhm.
lens for what was going on. So in this assignment, I was asked to do whatever, and they would write a paragraph about that. And then the next part was talking about the process of them completing whatever assignment they were doing, whether it was group work. And if it was group work, they were asked to focus on the part they did
Mhm.
specifically in the context of the larger project, so that they weren't pointing fingers at classmates who may have pulled their weight or may not have pulled their weight. The focus was really on their learning from the experience. And then from there it was, what did they actually learn after they
Mhm.
talked about what they did? What can they do now that they couldn't do before? And how do they know? And then align it with the standards that we discussed were actually being assessed, and then start to self-assess how well they did against those standards. Where is the evidence from this work that suggests I am approaching or meeting or
Mhm.
exceeding standards? So now they're also demonstrating their understanding of those specific things through actual evidence in their work. And then at the end, what would they have done differently if they had the opportunity now, looking back on the experience? And how would that help them advocate for the help they needed to get there?
Mhm.
And then if there was a rubric provided or success criteria provided at the end, where are they falling on that spectrum? Which was always the very last thing that they kind of came to, because they knew I really didn't want to have to put a grade on things, but
Mhm.
at the end of it, in my system, I still needed to do that. So when you're teaching kids, Isaac, younger ones,
Mhm.
how to share their understanding of their growth in
Mhm.
this way through reflection, whether you're still using that example of the
Mhm.
drawing or storytelling, if we're talking about narratives, maybe they're doing oral storytelling at that time.
Right.
How do you get them to communicate their understanding?
Yeah, and so, all the same, uh, not needs, but whatever the word would be, but like all the same pieces need to be in place. Like you said, we start with just understanding what are we trying to do here? What does proficient look like?
Mhm.
Where am I in this progression is huge. But for them to have the language for it, they've got to have that deep personal understanding of what am I attempting and where am I now again. So, if it's written work, which might be a combination of at this point in the year, especially, a few letters, and they may or may not represent the sounds of the words we're using yet, or they may, if we're thinking kinder, and those more detailed drawings. But because younger learners are of just by nature more concrete, we have to make sure there's no intermediaries. So when we want them to talk about their progress, they need to literally be able to see it. And so that's part of the power of a portfolio, is to say,
Mm.
this is where you were. And in kinder, their work can change in a week or two to look like a completely different child did the work. And it's hard for them sometimes to remember that. But if we show, here's where you were before, here's where you were after that, here's where you are now, and then here are some of our other samples, they can really talk about it. And if we support it a little bit by saying, well, why do you say it's better? Why do you say it looks more like your friend or your dog or whatever you're drawing? What do you mean that we can tell where it happened? Then they kind of build that, excuse me, language as they go. And I recently did a writing session with our good friends in the BOCES, and one of my favorite images was one of those moths that looks like an owl from behind, because the point was that mimicry is how we become writers and how we become readers and how we become mathematicians. We're always, both standing on the shoulders of others, but also kind of in their shadow. And so, especially with younger children, we don't need them to discover how to provide feedback. We're there for it. And so we use those simple protocols I've learned through Paul Bloomberg and others, but like glow and grow. What do you notice that really showed out? What do you notice they can
And
maybe do next? And with those in mind, they just have to know what it is that they're looking for. So if they know you need a horizon line, then they can speak to that. And so that was a really long answer to say we need to see some examples, or even with the oral reading, sometimes our notes are the portfolio for that. And we try to bring them back and say, you've been working so hard on reading the words that are on the page, and now you're doing that so well. I want you to read it just like a teacher would, or just like it would sound if you said it, or whatever you choose. So we're always bringing in where you were, where you are now, where you're headed. Yeah, and I love seeing that. And musicians, yes. And it's interesting because Paul, that when I first met him, and he's just on my mind because he taught me so much about feedback, especially self and peer assessment. He and I are both musicians, and he would always bring it back to that. Like, we listen to the greatest musicians in the world on our instruments, knowing we're not going to be right there, but knowing that we're working through a progression trying to get there. Same thing with dance or anything. So that was a really long answer. I'm not sure I answered what you asked, but it's basically the same as with an 18-year-old, but just a little more support and the content's different.
Which, I mean, to that end as well, I don't know how natural academic reflection really is.
Mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm,
mean, I think reflection is very human, and the idea to think about mistakes we've made in our relationships maybe, or
mm-hmm,
in
mm-hmm,
different things that we're doing. And even when we think about gameplay, which so many teenagers, if I ask my son to analyze his
mm-hmm,
gameplay in terms of why he's able to do so well in some games and not others, he could really break down
mm-hmm,
the areas of strength he has in those games and which friends he likes to play with because their strengths play on his strengths. And um, I don't think it's as natural with
mm-hmm.
learning academic things or musical things or art things we do in school. I'm not sure it's as automatic as we would think and hope it was. So even those tools that you're talking about with
Mm-hmm.
kindergartners, Isaac, are also very helpful with the older kids
Right.
who may not have had the experiences of coming through a system
Mm-hmm.
where they were taught to do this when they were younger. Because imagine the power of being taught in your kinder year how to think about your learning, how to talk about it, how to align it, how to
Mm-hmm.
give good feedback to your peers around specific criteria. And then every single year from there, having the opportunity to nurture that learning and watch it grow over
Mm-hmm.
time, as opposed to coming into a situation in high school, even if it's in ninth grade, where a teacher is telling you that a big part of your learning is you spending the time to think about your learning also.
Right.
Where am I now? Why am I there? And where am I going? How do I know I'm getting there? Even
Mm-hmm.
those simple, visible learning questions that come up. How does that translate into a reflection or self-assessment that gives teachers an opportunity to formatively assess, make better instructional plans, because really that's what all this is about. Not
Mm-hmm.
only giving students voice about their learning, but they're giving us data that we then have to use to not just put a grade on something or assess it for a grade book, but to really consider our instruction. Is it working the way that we want it to? Because it doesn't matter if I've taught all the content in the world
Mm-hmm.
if the
Mm-hmm.
kids aren't getting what they need. So this is that opportunity for teachers to also get the feedback they need. Like, I taught A, B, and C. Did the
Yeah.
students learn it? Because we know, unfortunately, that those two things are not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
synonymous
Mm-hmm.
with each other. Just because I taught it doesn't mean they got it.
And
Right.
Matt shared thinking right along those lines. And I think you're both making strong points is that kids have to be taught to do this. Just, you know, the mindfulness meditation movement and things like this that have, really exploded into the mainstream over the last decade or so really are still new to at least many of us in Western societies. And even just, I was working with our great friends in PS205. I guess that was yesterday. And,
Oh, the days they
yeah,
bleed.
sometime in the last 12 years of this month. But we were really talking about how sometimes the break for reflection can be as simple as we got this picture of a young woman just making the timeout sign. And so you just need to stop and think because we get so caught up in doing it that we're not really aware of how we're doing. We're often not aware of why. And I think part of why it either isn't or doesn't seem natural for kids to do this is because the systems we've designed don't support
Mhm.
it at all and really do the opposite. We
Right.
put one or a few people in very much in positions of power who are the determiners of what is good, what is not, who is doing well, all those things. And so I think that's part of how, even with our youngest children, because culturally they may not have had opportunities for that kind of thinking, uh, I think it is a big shift. And as you and Matt have said, we have to be very transparent about why this matters.
Yep.
That we have a goal to shift this learning to you, and that I'm a teacher, I'm a professional, I went to school for this, I've done it more years than I've done anything else in my life, but you still are the number one person who can give yourself feedback and can improve your work. I can
Right.
help, I can guide, but if you see something you can do to improve, you will do it. Uh, and even very young children understand that. It's just that we're using slightly different language and we're talking about, uh, using a tool to count beyond 10 or something, whatever it might be, instead of writing a, you know, essay analyzing multiple texts that you've read, over the last semester. But I agree. It does take a lot of us to make this feel natural.
And I think to that end as well, what's crazy is that we have these systems in place that we're
Hmm.
trying to unstructure. Kids become so accustomed to us being the only person in the room who could tell them if they're right or
Hmm.
wrong, that in a lot of ways we are disenfranchising them from their own learning. We are putting up situations where they could feel really good about something they did. And then all of a sudden, I tell them that it didn't meet my standards and therefore
Hmm.
it isn't as good. I could give you a perfect example. Um, my son is doing school from home right now, and he took a Chinese test the other day. And when he first took it, he came out, he's like, I think I aced it.
Right.
But he was concerned because sometimes things don't translate so well in those Google Forms with the
Hmm.
language and
Hmm.
not having the opportunity to be in a class with the teacher and really ask questions along the way. He got the test back today and it didn't go the way that he thought it had, and it was mostly the multiple choice that was problematic.
Hmm.
And his teacher now won't even, like now he's got to reach out and figure out why it happened the way that it did and see if she's willing to go beyond the test corrections. But
Hmm.
why is one person in the room the only determiner as to how good something is? And
Hmm. Hmm.
when we take that agency away from kids so early on and we make them dependent on our own feedback, that they don't even want to get feedback from their peers because they don't trust it as much as they trust us. And it's this real false trust because although I might be very good at what I did in the classroom, as were
Hmm.
you, Isaac,
Hmm.
I'm not the only expert and I don't know how to do everything. And sometimes the advice I would give doesn't work for every kid the
Hmm.
same way. So even just helping them understand that when they go into this world outside of school, they have to learn to trust that voice that they hear themselves and that they do know sometimes. And that's part of the advocacy piece too, like knowing when you can trust yourself,
Right.
knowing when you need to advocate, and knowing the right questions to ask
Hmm.
so that you know when you need help and what questions are going to get you the help that you need.
That's really making me think. I mean, we all make connections to what we're doing right now. And
Yeah.
again, I want to mention my friends at PS205. But next week, they're digging into responsibility as part of their SEL and their morning meetings. What you're describing is really tied to that, is that we're responsible for our learning. And that doesn't mean that it's all your fault when you fail. It means that your decisions have an impact. And I think it's very easy to teach that out of kids early on when we get used to saying, like, this is how it goes. Now you copy me. Now I'm going to tell you whether you did it well or not. And no teacher is actually doing that. So I just want to be clear, that's an exaggeration on purpose. But I'm talking about my own experiences where I basically said, this is the way to do it. And I didn't mean to say that, but that's how it would have sounded if I was a 5-year old, 11-year old, whatever, in my room. And then I was the final answer on how you did. And like you said, like, what was my back end? Like, maybe we had extra credit. We always did.
Oh,
You could always revise quizzes and
we could
stuff.
do a whole thing on extra
But
credits here.
why did
That's
I not
cool there.
know? Yeah, that, like, what I was saying was not what I was doing. I was saying we're learning all year and we're getting better. But because of my grading policies at the time, what I was really saying is whoever's first to this is going to have a higher grade. And no matter who's really strong or even beyond my expectations at the end. If you started slowly, then you're going to be basically penalized for that. But yeah, it just made me think that that responsibility can't be developed in a vacuum. So you have to have opportunities to make choices and decisions that may benefit you or may result in a complete and utter failure. But then now that's your failure. And I'm here as a professional to help you. So just reach out. We'll talk about it. We'll figure it out. Let's try again. The year's not over.
Well, I mean, if you think about adult learners for that matter,
Mm-hmm.
then, switching it over where we are in a situation now
Mm-hmm.
where we are responsible for our own learning. And, you know, a lot of school districts don't have structures for professional learning that you're supposed to
Right.
do. But if we are educators and we're trying to teach kids
Mm-hmm.
to have more agency, to think about what they know, think about what they need to know, think about what they want to know, and then we go out and find PD. And I know for a while I was going through a lot of ed camps because I found that they were the most flexible and
Mm-hmm.
thoughtful ways for me to stretch my thinking and be in dialogue with other educators who may or may not be on the same page with me, which I found, very useful. But I also had a lot of colleagues while I was in leadership and also in different schools who
Mm-hmm.
had no interest whatsoever in stretching their practice. They
Mm-hmm.
had been doing it for a long time. They found PD to be useless. And I'm not going to lie, some PD is useless when it doesn't pay attention to the needs of the folks in the room and
Right.
it's one size fits all. And it's all those things we tell
Mm-hmm.
teachers they shouldn't be doing with kids. Because often, ironically, professional learning ends up being that way.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I see that you had written something. I want to read what Matt wrote here. Kids
Mm-hmm.
constantly own their failures. I hear so much about how I'm not good at this, and it's true. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the system does that as well. That we focus heavily on what we can't do, that deficit model, instead of flipping that record and thinking about what I can do well and how I can continue to grow off of that. I may have failures, but how do I take those failures and turn them into successes?
Mm-hmm.
And how can I take the stuff that I'm already good at and not discount it because I still have to work on this
Right.
other stuff also, which I think is really important.
So you're really talking more about that student self-efficacy, that
Yes.
understanding that what I do has an impact, and that I'm confident that with what I have and what I know about learning and the support I have, I can master this, just not yet. Uh, Within reason,
Yeah.
I'm never going to be a professional athlete. I'm never going to do this, never going to do that. But that's not my goal. I can get a lot better at this, which is what I'm focusing my energy on, because I've been uh, at the front of the room in some of those useless trainings. Not the one taking notes, but the one realizing partway through this is not what they needed, or this is not working. Uh, and in some cases, I've been very vulnerable and open about that and said, let's stop. What do we need to do
Yep.
right now? How can we fix this up? Other times I've pushed on through, and you can guess which times ended well.
I think that that's true, though, in teaching as well, Isaac.
Mm-hmm,
And I
mm-hmm.
think that it takes a confident learner to stand in
Right.
front of a room to say, you know what,
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of planning, but I missed the mark.
Yeah.
And you have to be comfortable and confident enough to gauge the room, take
Mm-hmm.
the feedback, and switch gears. And sometimes you're successful when you switch the gears, and sometimes maybe not so much, but it's still a learning experience for
Mm-hmm.
everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And as we're wrapping up, today, I certainly want everyone out there to think about, where they're putting reflection into their own practice, not just
Mm-hmm.
what we're asking kids to do, but how are you modeling it for kids? Are you
Mm-hmm.
doing think alouds with them? Are you allowing them to see, when we're talking at the beginning of something, are we inviting students in to give us that information? Are we also inviting students in at the end to have a conversation about what could have gone better and why, and
Mm-hmm.
how that would have improved the learning experience? And, you know, to Isaac's earlier comment, next week, our last week in the series, we're going to be talking about portfolios the power of them, how to use them, how to create them, and then most importantly, how to teach kids to use them to track their learning and
Mhm.
really show evidence of their learning over time, because that's really what they're all about. So thank you so much today, Isaac, for being with
Of
me to
course,
talk
I'm so
about
glad I
this.
was able to today.
And thanks, Matt, for always being a great
Yeah.
part of our live shows and being a fill-in when we need you to be. And we hope everybody has an awesome weekend, and we'll see you next week.